Thank you, Susan. However, these are quotes, not notes. Ja i nie znał, że my byli w łapach u humanistów. I failed to understand we had fallen into the hands of the humanists, said the poet Osip Mandelstam to his wife Nadezhda in Moscow in winter 37. He was speaking, of course, of the Moscow purges that were then accelerating, which were to take about 1 million lives, his included, as he rightfully suspected. At the same time, the media were full of enunciations about the wonderful, rational, and pro-human nature of the system that was consuming itself through the Moscow trials. Stalin had, a year and a half earlier, given his famous speech about how life has become better, happier, and freer, end quote. For whom? Well, for the humans, for humanity. And these were the humanists into whose paws, as Mandelstam said, humanity had fallen. Now, in order to be able to do this work of betterment of humanity, at least 3 elements were needed. A theory was needed that would explain what should be done and how. A state apparatus was necessary to implement this theory throughout society, and the repressive apparatus was necessary to eliminate those who stood in the way. Nothing terribly new there. Those 3 elements were present already in Tsarist Russia, and in fact are present in one shape or another in any discernible state formation that humans have created. The specific difference that Mandelstam was referring to was the fact that all 3 elements were permeated by a messianic ideology that said that whatever the system is doing is not only necessary for its preservation, which is the justification given by repressive systems everywhere and always, but in fact is desirable because it leads to the betterment of humanity. And the humanists that Mandelstam was referring to were, of course, Russian disciples of Karl Marx, himself a later generation representative of the Aufklärung. Having said that, I'm not entirely sure if Marx would recognize Stalin as a legitimate Marxist. And it's quite possible that Rousseau would not recognize his social theory in Karl Marx. But without engaging in what the French call a procès d'intention, without imputing motivation and intention after the fact, we need to realize that the totalitarian system that the Soviet Union had built and the mass murder and at least one genocide it entailed followed in the broad legacy of the Enlightenment through a fundamental device which before that was simply not available. It is the idea of the redemptive activity of the state. Until the Enlightenment, the state was simply the band of thugs that people paid ransom to protect them from even worse thugs. Nobody in the Middle Ages was of the opinion that the local baron should also engage in building schools, in funding hospitals, and improving the general well-being of the nation. This was the truly radical invention of the Enlightenment, the idea that the state is legitimate insofar as it works for the benefit of the common good. And, well, if something stands in the way of the common good, it is not only the state's right, but indeed its obligation to remove this obstacle to ensure the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It's extremely facile to build irony on top of irony about that. The starting point is to recognize that if we're here, it's because of the Enlightenment. The very idea that the state is supposed to allocate funds for public education has made the Einstein Forum possible, has made universal education possible, and without it, we wouldn't be here to complain about the negative consequences it might also entail. Having said that, this does not give us the right to ignore those consequences or to consider them just an accident on the way to universal happiness. What I'll try to demonstrate is that the possibility of radical evil was contained within the broadly framed Enlightenment project, not as a necessity, but as a potentiality. And without it, the project would not be possible. So the state had the obligation to better its citizens, right? This meant, okay, educate the kids, take care of the sick, provide some kind of mechanism for the indigent. Better or worse, the state was learning the 19th and 20th century how to do it, and thank God for that. But what happens if in the course of development you run into people who simply refuse to be bettered, that stand in the way of universal progress, indeed happiness, to the detriment of the greater good of the greater numbers? A Turkish doctor, Dr. Mehmet Nazim, who was an active member of the Committee of Union and Progress, the very Enlightenment group of intellectuals and higher officers that seized power in Ottoman Turkey in the early 20th century and went on to lead the empire to its greatest historical disaster, committing a genocide in the process, stated at a meeting of the Comité Union et Progrès, because of course, considering themselves heirs of the Enlightenment, this Turkish party gave itself a French name. So he said, referring to the Armenian question, and I quote, "If we were to be satisfied with local massacres, like the one in Adana, late 19th century, or elsewhere in 1909, if the purge would not be universal and final, this will unavoidably lead to problems. It is therefore absolutely necessary to eliminate the Armenian people entirely, so that there will no more be on the earth an Armenia, and the very concept will be eliminated." Now, in history, we've got tons of massacres. The idea of killing people because they're in the way is well, possibly not the driving force, but certainly a driving force of human history. However, the idea to eliminate the people entirely so that the problem will be solved once for all is a very modern idea. It does not occur earlier. If you read about what happens. And you can start with Tacitus and go through Piccolomini or through reports on European religious wars. If you read what happens when the army finally enters a besieged city, it's more or less always the same. What follows is an orgy of murder, looting, torture, rape, and that will go on for days. In my account, after reading dozens of such reports, 5 is the median number, 5 days. And the reason is very simple. There can be too much of a good thing. I mean, everybody loves to murder and torture and rape, of course, but eventually you get satiated. And once this happens, if somebody survives, let them live. Who cares? What the good doctor was referring to was a completely different project, not one that gives fun to the perpetrators. It actually might be nasty and unpleasant, but it has to be done in order for the very concept of Armenia to be eliminated. And as we know, the Comité Union et Progrès was quite successful in this Armenian project and was followed by other emulators of the concept. In Memel in 1942, an officer of the Wehrmacht remarked in a letter home describing how horrible it is to shoot all those Jews all the time brought in by transports from the Reich to Latvia and Estonia, and you're supposed just to shoot them. But he says, God damn, a generation has to go through this for our children to have a better life. This is not somebody giving in to his bloodlust. This is a conscientious servant of the state implementing a policy which is for the common good. At the receiving end was an 8-year-old Jewish kid described by Emanuel Ringelblum in his Chronicle of the Warsaw Ghetto. He noticed in April 1940 and wrote it down that in a refugee relief point, an 8-year-old child, we do not know if it was a girl or a boy, went crazy. He started screaming, I want to steal, I want to rob, I want to eat, I want to be German. Just like the officer I quoted before, that kid drew the ultimate logical consequences of what he or she was witnessing, right? Since those who live are Germans, and Jews by definition do not live, if I want to live, therefore I need to be German. In the same way, the officer I quoted drew the logical conclusion. If I want to be German, I have to kill, so that our children will have a safe and better future, right? Ringelblum was wrong when he said that the child had lost its senses. The child was being absolutely logical in a world that lost its senses and was engaging in a thoroughly logical project if one makes allowance for the total irrationality of its founding principles. And here, of course, we encounter a fundamental intellectual difficulty, because even if it is possible, if somewhat tenuous, to draw a line that starts with Voltaire, goes through Marx and Stalin, and ends with Mandelstam dying in the Gulag, such a direct filiation is not really possible in the case of fascism. Fascism was, by self-definition, anti-rational, anti-enlightenment, a return to genuine emotion if anything at all, it would find its intellectual antecedents in German Romanticism, in Giambattista Vico and his Scienza Nova, not in the dull and Jewish ruminations of a Karl Marx. So the starting point, in the case of fascism, is completely different. But victorious fascism inherited an Enlightenment state and used it to realize its goals, because the Enlightenment state differs from those ridiculous monarchies it had replaced by drawing its legitimacy from its own internal rules. The power is not given by God, is not certified by God, and if abused, will not have God turn its back upon it. As long as it is internally consistent and follows its own rules, it works. What happens if a God-given power is challenged? Well, we could see that in the Torah reading we read in synagogue, the Shabbat, Korach, yes, which speaks about an illegitimate rebellion against Moses, who was the God-given leader of the Jewish people. And after unsuccessful debate and disputation, well, the earth opens and swallows Korach and his followers and their families. It closes, end of story. So the pre-Enlightenment state could hope, if not for an actual manifestation of this kind of divine assessment of the legitimacy or otherwise of a political movement, at least threaten it can happen, right? The Enlightenment state consciously refuses this kind of justification. It is justified by its own internal logic. And once it makes the decision that internal logic is consistent and congruent with the goals, it functions. In Rwanda, in '94, the commander of the UN forces sent there to prevent a genocide, General Roméo Dallaire, noted in his diary that we started receiving worrying reports about the Ministry of Education sending out a circular to teachers to draw up lists of students by group, Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa. We thought it's weird, but so much was happening, we didn't look after it, and then the genocide happened anyway 2 months later. So I'm thinking of myself as a Rwandan teacher. I get this circular. Okay, stupid circular, right. First stupid circular I get from the ministry? Nah. And then maybe actually there is a sensible reason. Maybe they want to compare educational outcomes in those three groups in order to check if possibly the teaching of geography amongst the Twa could be improved because they get worse notes than the other two groups. And who cares? It's their problem, not mine. So the teachers drew up those lists and sent them back to the ministry. And what they did not know is that they were drawing up kill lists. Because once the genocide started, if some people were killed depending on the group that was marked in their identity papers. When you got your ID, it said you're Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. And when you presented your ID at the checkpoint, if it said Tutsi, that's where your travel would end. And if you said you've lost your ID, that's where your travel would end, because who else but the Tutsi would lose their ID, right? The problem is that you received your ID at age 18. Children didn't carry IDs. And contrary to what sometimes we can read in the media, Yes, there are some Rwandans who look very Tutsi. There are some Rwandans who look very Hutu. Most Rwandans look, well, like Rwandans. You can't tell the good from the bad apart just by looking at them. Aha, herein comes the list. The killers would come into the schools with the lists. So, the logical conclusion would be, never obey a stupid circular. Demand explanations. Demand guarantees that this will not be abused. Have them convince you. I'm pretty sure we've all run into such people. They're impossible to work with. And once the system eliminates them, everybody breathes a sigh of relief. And of course, no, it's true. It's impossible to work with them because the entire Enlightenment system is based on the division of labor, on the attribution of responsibility to those who are in the position to take responsibility, and the assumption that the state is working for benevolent ends. You challenge those assumptions, the system spits you out because you're simply not compatible with the system. And it is thanks to the system that we've got hospitals, the seminar, and a number of other nice things like median life duration extended almost twice, right? But the price is that people who challenge the system get kicked out, and normally this is good, because they really hinder the work of an otherwise benevolent system, except when it's bad. And when it's bad, these are the people you can run to ask for help and maybe even be saved. So, what mental process do you have to go through once the system goes bad? After all, the people who were implementing the genocides I'm mentioning, and incidentally, the title of my paper speaks about totalitarianism, genocide, and I could probably throw in half a dozen other nasty words. You don't need to have a totalitarianism to have a genocide, but the genocide is a pretty good example of what can go wrong in an Enlightenment state if it goes wrong. So I'd like to concentrate on the genocide only, without reducing the importance of all the other forms that nastiness can take. So, a state that engages in a genocide is still populated by people who are by and large rational, and probably most of them dislike murder. So, what do you need to do? You need to follow the rules. Irene Deutschkron, who was one of the Jewish teenagers who survived in Berlin in hiding in German families, and eventually returned to Berlin in her late age and died here, told me the following story about, I think it was an uncle of hers, anyway, a cousin, who was a German Beamter, and true to the role, at noon he would take a lunch break, and after the lunch he would go to the park, sit on a bench and feed the birds. And then one day he goes into the park and there are markings on the benches, right? There are benches painted yellow and the markings near Furieude. He sits on his bench, starts feeding the bird, and the sweet old lady passes by who knows him from whatever amt he was working at, and he said, "Oh, sir," she says, "you made a mistake. This is not your bench. Your bench is over there." He hadn't even noticed the markings, Ms. Deutschkron told me. Had somebody told the old lady that she had just sent the trains to Treblinka in motion, she would first not understand what we're talking about. Nobody knew about Treblinka until Treblinka happened. Second, this is the early 30s. Not even the Nazis had an idea of Treblinka in their mind. And third, in all probability, she will be totally outraged at the insinuation. She is simply asking somebody to follow the rules. She would have acted the same way if she would see this Beamter littering. She'd say, "Oh, sir, you dropped something." The presumption is that rules are there to be followed because ultimately this is in the greater common good. And the essence of the trap is that this is true. Once again, we are all enjoying the benefits of a rule-based system with the rules directed at the greater common good. But if somebody decides that the greater common good necessarily is based on eliminating somebody who is an obstacle to that good, well then you start with the comment that, sir, this is not your bench. Doctors tended to realize this earlier than other people. The doctor, Mehmet Nazim, whom I quoted, who was disappointed with the local massacres in Adana and said that we really need to go wholesale, was just one of a number of Turkish doctors who were very actively involved in the Armenian genocide. And the medical profession was overrepresented in that genocide, as it then would be in the T4 action and in the genocide of the Jews and the Roma. And this is especially striking as Turkey in the early 20th century had a deficit of doctors. You think that doctors would be busy healing people and not killing people. But, says Rashid Bey, another doctor, though I am a doctor, I cannot ignore my nationality. I was born a Turk. My national identity takes priority to anything else. The Armenian traitors have found themselves a nest within the homeland. They were dangerous germs. Isn't the destruction of germs the obligation of a doctor? Either the Armenians will eliminate the Turks and become owners of the land, or they will be eliminated by the Turks. I therefore had no doubts, and I chose. Notice this argumentation that reduces the group we have objection to a biological factor, germs, microbes. This is exactly the language Hitler used when he said that, the first quote I could find, but possibly the earlier ones, comes from 23, from an interview he gave to the American fascist George Virek. He says, "The influence of the Jew is destructive. We are like a tuberculosis patient who isn't even aware that he's condemned unless he eliminates the microbes from his breathing system. Nations, like individuals, are capable of the wildest things when they are on the brink, which is why I say we need violent remedial methods, strong medicine, possibly amputation." Now, okay, he didn't always put his metaphors straight. If he's implying that the amputation of the lungs would save the patient, he probably would need a refresher course in medicine. But the line of thinking is clear. And he expressed it in another statement. I just didn't have the time to find the source. In which he, no, that's in Mein Kampf actually, in which he strongly criticizes German emotional anti-Semitism. He said, yeah, Germans get really angry about Jews and they complain about Jews this, Jews that, we shouldn't feel any emotion at all. The doctor who cures a patient does not feel emotion about the microbes he kills. He simply stands on the side of a superior life form against an inferior life form that threatened the superior life form. And this language of microbes or vermin is very current, especially in pre-genocide language. If it becomes part of the public discourse, this should send off red alarm lights flashing, because not every comparison of people to microbes or vermin necessarily leads to genocide, but I haven't seen a genocide that was not preceded by this kind of transformation. In Rwanda, the Hutu power activists would call the Tutsis inyenzi, cockroaches. And the very sweet gentleman who I talked to after he had emerged, after having done 16 years for genocide, explained to me, look, I understand the cockroach wants to live, sure, but does it have to live in my house? I mean, would you want cockroaches in your house? Well, there you see. So once you realize that, even if the consequences are unpleasant, if you're a responsible person, you do the necessary. Part of the popularity of the microbe vermin scheme comes from seeing the nation as an organism, a biological thing which is objectively different from other organisms. This is our Dr. Rashid Bey speaking. I was born a Turk, and my Turkish identity takes precedence over everything else. This goes on well with German romantic nationalist thinking, and doesn't go well at all with classical Marxist thinking that would consider nationalism a false ideology at best, right? And definitely would be opposed to the idea that there is something essentially different between a Russian and a Belarusian or a Pole or a German. Interestingly, although these kind of references appear also in Stalinist propaganda, the Great Purge starts with trials of the Vredители, usually translated into English as wreckers, but in fact the more precise translation would be varmints or pests. These are the insects or the rodents that ruin a garden, right? So one would be tempted to think that the analogy is here, right? Cockroaches, microbes, varmints. It's the garden that is important. There are some references in Nazi ideology in which the garden metaphor is used, that it is necessary to eliminate all the wrong kind of plants that would grow in a garden, to enable the flowers and the fruit-bearing plants to grow. Walter Darré, who was an agronomist who became Reichsbauerführer. That was actually an official title. I'm always very impressed with those titles. Would express such sentiments, but by and large it was the medical metaphor that functioned in Nazism, and it was the garden metaphor that functioned under Stalinism. So, for instance, already Makarenko, the great Soviet pedagogist who set up orphanages for the orphans of the Civil War and tried to build communism in the orphanage, it worked to the extent it could, as you can imagine. He would say, our children blossom on the living stem of our life. They're not flowers. They're a wonderful apple garden. And that garden is ours. Please undertake this work. Water it. Nourish it. Eliminate the caterpillars. Cut off the bad branches. Remember the teaching of the great gardener Stalin. Now, this might not be the most obvious association we would have with Stalin. Stalin, the great gardener, actually, it was quite often used. In an article in Pravda in 1932, we read a paean to Stalin that goes, "Wise teacher, Marxist gardener, you cultivate the plant of communism." And so on and so forth. I could bring in chapter and verse. Now, it is interesting to look at those two different metaphors. As I say, the difference is not full. There was some gardening metaphor in the Third Reich, and there was some medical metaphor in the Stalin Soviet Union. But by and large, those two different metaphors prevailed. The medical metaphor is optimistic. It really says that if there's something wrong, all you need to do is eliminate the factor that causes the malady, and everything will be okay. To use an Enlightenment expression, éliminer le naturel, il revient au galop. Try to eliminate what's natural and it will return running, right? So if you just allow the natural to express itself, you take care of the germs and other cockroaches, then by nature, everything will be fine. The gardening metaphor is much less trusting. A gardener doesn't do his work once. A gardener needs to be always present, always on the lookout. There's always a bad branch to be cut off, a sneaky caterpillar that entered the garden and needs to be tracked down. Possibly not enough water given to the plants. And yes, if somebody hasn't given enough water, he or she is a wrecker and goes where wreckers go. But by and large, the Nazi metaphor allows us to imagine a world in which we're all happy and natural because all the microbes have been eliminated. No such naive hopes under Stalin. The gardener needs to be there, always vigilant, always watching. And even if he is not present there in the flesh, he is present there in the imagination. The idea of walking the garden can be just as effective as the gardener himself, as long as you believe in that idea. And even if you don't believe, as long as you remember the gardening that has already been done. That actually works quite well for quite some time. The Gulag was disbanded after Stalin died, and yet the memory of the Gulag was strong enough to crush 2 successive generations. It's only when people started losing memory of the good old days that it turned out that the physical gardener would probably do the job better, but at that time there was no suitable candidate. So what has all this to do with Enlightenment? Lots. Both metaphors, both the gardening metaphor and the medical metaphor, stem directly from the best that the Enlightenment had to offer humanity, and it offered, and it worked. The fact that we are also incomparably healthier than we were when the Enlightenment started is empirical proof that Enlightenment works. if it worked with us, why can't it work on the level of society, on the level of humanity as a whole? After all, there is no ultimate instance to which we can refer ourselves. If it works, it should be done the greatest good for the greatest number. I would venture that even before Norman Borlaug's Green Revolution, rational agricultural science proved Malthus wrong in a spectacular way. Again, this is enlightened thought, eliminating sloppy thinking and moving humanity forwards. Those two huge successes gave legitimacy to the metaphors. And the idea that I am allowed, indeed I am required to trust the state, which is capable of all that good, enabled the state to go bad when it chose to go bad. So, what, if anything, can be done? I'm not entirely sure about the powers of education. In Rwanda, I was told how classes would begin in all schools Monday morning. The history teacher would tell the children a story from the history of Rwanda about the evils of Tutsi rule. A favorite story was about a Tutsi queen who apparently, when she was sitting on her throne, would hold in her right hand a spear with the business end downwards, which would rest on the body of a Hutu child. So when she would rise, yes, children, this is what the Tutsis did. Now, will all the Tutsi children please rise so that we will know who is who? Thank you. Next class is mathematics. Once the Enlightenment state is in control of education, it can actually educate and improve our lot. But this contains within itself the possibility of such a Monday morning class. So frankly, I think that our best hope is the non-cooperative Rwandan teacher. The guy who says, I'm not giving them any list until they convince me, they persuade me, I'm not going to cooperate. Now that teacher obviously is out of the system, but he's still around. And that's a person who, although he or she knows that it's perfectly legitimate to pass on moral responsibility to whoever is higher up. This was Zygmunt Bauman's argument in Modernity and the Holocaust, as you remember, that one of the things that makes the Shoah modern and not a throwback to the Middle Ages or to barbarism, as we very conveniently said, in order to say, okay, this couldn't be us, okay, this is some kind of horrible story from the past that just reemerged. And Bauman showed step by step how division of labor, attribution of responsibility to superior positions and all that, all of those elements of modernity made the Shoah possible. So somebody who refuses this modernity, who actually sticks his belief that even if the state says it's right, it's still wrong, and if it's wrong, I'm supposed to do something about it. That's probably our best hope. Now, this should be taken with a very small quantifier. That is, what I'm explicitly not saying is that we all should be this person, because by the time everybody will convince everybody that the procedures are right, we'll all be dead of COVID or something else, right? What I'm saying is that without a sufficient number of such conscious opponents, to use a term from another context, just enough to throw a spanner in the works now and then, we are doomed. With them, we are not saved, but we have a chance. Without them, we're doomed, the way we're doomed if we would all become those conscious objectors. And I had the great privilege of knowing a number of Polish righteous Gentiles, Poles who risked their life to save Jews during the war. And the very interesting thing about them is that they really didn't have anything in common. I tried to figure them out, okay? It wasn't politics. They went from extreme left to extreme right. It wasn't religion. Some were militant atheists. Some were totally bigoted Catholics or Christians of another orientation. Some of them were princes of the blood. Some of them were thieves. The two are not mutually exclusive, but the one thing that I eventually discovered that they have in common is the fact that they were simply not able to leave well enough alone. Once they were confronted with something they defined as evil, they had to react to it. And it was the evil that made them react, not the person of the victim. It was the evil itself. One of those guys, after a long and extremely pleasant vodka drinking evening, told me, look, I'll tell you because you probably will understand. You know, when I helped mother, he was a teenager helping his mother save a Jewish family next door, a mother and her daughter, both survived. He said, when I was helping mother, it wasn't about liking the Jews. I actually didn't like them. And then he grew pale and he thought, oh shit, I'll be called an anti-Semite. And he made me promise I will never reveal his name. And now he's dead and nobody can free me from that promise. But he had hit the nail on the head. It is not about your feelings towards the victim. It's about your feelings of the rightness or wrongness of the actions of the perpetrator. And in order to be able to have such feelings so strong that you'll be willing to stake your life on them, you don't really fit in the scheme of things of the Enlightenment state. And with this, I'll conclude.
I'm actually going to have the first comment question, and I was afraid that I was too exhausted to, push back on this quite brilliant discussion. It's only part of a pushback, and it's only towards the very end, okay? What lots of people are surprised me. I see well. If I was counting on Leah, I was counting on Ben, I was counting on Elijah. Yeah, okay, all right. But, so Kant leads his readers in the Critique of Practical Reason to believe that they're going to get a proof of the moral law as something necessary, like the category of causality is necessary for us to have coherent experience. And of course, it's a thing that everybody wants. You want, hey, we're going to get a transcendental deduction that you can use to shut up Stalin or the relativist kid in the back of your class or whoever it is, okay? And so he builds up this whole machinery that absolutely parallels the Critique of Pure Reason. And then just when you think you're going to get a transcendental deduction, what you get is a thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this. Imagine a man who says he can't resist temptation when he goes by a certain house. This is 18th century speak for brothel, okay? But he would find if you put a gallows in front of the house, and he were told that he would be executed the minute he exits the house, you would find he could resist temptation very well. Take the same man who lives with a tyrannical king, an unjust king, who wants to execute an opponent, but there's still some semblance of law, unlike in the United States. Really, this is anymore. And he tells the man that he wants him to sign a statement saying that the opponent has committed tyranny, and if he doesn't sign this statement, he will be executed himself. And what Kant says is, no one knows what they would do in this situation, but all of us know what we should do, and therefore what we could do. And this is his proof of both freedom and the moral law, that we could defy the unjust tyrant, though it goes against not only our bodily desires, but our life itself. So all I'm saying, and other people will have things to say, I'm sure, all I'm saying is you cannot say that the Störenfried, the person who can't go along with him, that doesn't come out of the Enlightenment, because that is the heart of the Enlightenment. Okay, I don't know who was first. David, Leah, okay. David, Leah, Ben, and then I'll go to the other side.
I'll try to be quick here, because there's a lot of people. Thanks for the incredibly provocative, wonderful talk. But I wonder if how much you can really put on the shoulders of the Enlightenment here. To begin with, kingship. The idea that everybody before the Enlightenment was simply the biggest bully. What about the duties of kingship? What about the duties of a king to keep the peace, to maintain justice, to care for people, to guide them towards salvation? All of these things. What the Enlightenment, to the extent that we can generalize about it, what happens in the 18th century is that the person of the monarch can become replaced by the abstraction of the state. Mm-hmm. But that's not saying that what existed before didn't care for the people, that there was no such thing as caring for the people beforehand. And at the same time, was it really only when you have the abstraction of the state that you could think of eliminating an entire group? In my own period, 1685, Louis XIV decides that France will be free of Protestants. And they can have the choice of either emigrating, of converting, or dying. And this is a choice that is given to religious minorities throughout history, long before the Enlightenment. What probably saves a large number of Huguenots is less the beneficent intentions of the king than the capacities of the French state at the time. So there's a question to what extent the modern horrors and genocides are a result of the increasing capacity of the state, as opposed to the ideas that are motivating and undergirding these policies.
The duties of the king, as you described them, seem to come out straight up from a Stalin quote about the duties of the Communist Party. The Communist Party needs to lead the people towards a better future. It needs to protect it from threats. It needs to improve their moral standing, indeed lead them to secular salvation. Will lead us to socialism, and from socialism to communism, and by then we'll all be angels. As to the capacity of genocide, that's one element. But please, if the Jews had been given the option, well, we'll either kill you, or we'll let you emigrate, or you can convert, we would be having a thriving Jewish community in Germany even after the fall of the Third Reich, right? This is the differentia specifica. Part of it is the technology, although technology isn't that important. The Rwandan genocide was more efficient, if I dare say so, per capita, than the German gas chambers were, okay? You can actually kill more people by machetes if you mobilize the entire nation. So technology is important, but secondary. The primary thing is, well, the intellectual courage, the imagination to imagine a world in which there will be no more Protestants, not because they've emigrated across the Atlantic and we'll never hear about them again, we're safe, right? There'll be no more Protestants because they're all been slaughtered, end of story. This is innovative. However, I would agree with you, especially remembering our conversation yesterday, that while we can identify an intellectual filiation, it doesn't go the other way around. That is, no, we cannot blame Rousseau for the Gulag. And it's not about blaming Rousseau for the Gulag. It is about showing the multiple consequences of a radical new project of society, especially one that worked. And as to the Kantian example, that everyone will know what the right thing to do would be, I'm pretty sure Stalin did not read Kant. He was much too busy doing other things. But one of the things that he did was to prove that everybody will know what the right thing to do is, and that is confess. Both totalitarianisms needed this as an ultimate proof, not only of their power, but on their righteousness. And without proof of righteousness, the very idea starts crumbling because the regime understands just how much it is demanding of everybody, right? And if it doesn't have a guaranteed path to salvation, it cannot make those demands. And the best proof of the fact that it has the guaranteed road to salvation is, like we saw yesterday in the play, to have even the opponents confess that they were wrong and the system is right.
All right, I tried. Leah, take it away.
Thank you. Well, I'm not so convinced that we can blame Jesus Christ for the Crusades. And so for the same reason, we can't blame, I think, Enlightenment philosophers for some of the excesses of the 20th century. But I actually wanted to share a story with you. It goes more in the spirit of what you're saying. So this is now arguing against myself. I spent a lot of time recently reading memoirs of survivors from the Jewish ghetto in Salonika. And at some point, one of the survivors reflects on what could have saved lives at some point. And the story is the following. In the mid-30s, a new chief rabbi arrives who is born in Austro-Hungary, Ashkenazi Jew. The Jews of Salonika are all Sephardic Jew. He speaks perfect German. He's read the Enlightenment, studied the Enlightenment, had written a PhD thesis on depictions of hell in Islam and Judaism and so on and so forth. He's very learned. Everyone loves him because he's this intellectual culture. Then those are the backward Jews, Sephardic, Balkan, and so on. And at some point, the Nazis arrive, and the lists are drawn by the chief rabbi, who actually speaks German perfectly, communicates very quickly, is really efficient, has this kind of Prussian ethos in him. And one of the survivors says, if only we'd had a Sephardic chief rabbi rather than an Ashkenazi. You know, one of these Balkan people who say, oh, I went there, I tried to get the list, I couldn't find the people, it took a long time, then I knocked on this door, they couldn't open, everything was delayed, and so I go again next week, just bear with me, and so on. And I actually think a lot about this story whenever the Eurocrats come to Albania to ask about conditionality processes and ask us, you know, have you done conditionality? Are you implementing all the EU laws and so on? And everyone thinks that doing it efficiently and quickly is going to be a benefit. And I often think about this story and think, well, maybe we need to delay a little bit and just think about what we're doing. So, yeah.
Boy, I was counting on another Kantian. Ben, give it.
So, in general, I find the account convincing that the rationality of the state, when justified by popular sovereignty, then gives you a very dangerous situation where the tendency is to let the state handle things. But I'm wondering whether there's not only an Enlightenment genealogy to that state, And I'm wondering whether something on the bureaucratization of state processes and where the patron saints of that process would be Max Weber, and from the other direction, of course, Kafka's account of the bureaucratic state, which is more significant. And one other thing that comes out of a kind of awkward debate, the principles, and I don't know very much about this other than the principles, of the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo war crimes tribunals. Is there such a thing as a war crime defined in retrospect? What is the moral law on this? Now, one of the heroes of the post-colonial age is a man called Radha Binod Pal, who was a dissenting judge at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Yeah. Basically, he said there's no such thing as a war crime, retrospective justice, and so on. And he didn't even attend the sessions. He sat in his room and he wrote this dissenting judgment. How do these fit into the concept that you've been trying to give us?
Well, two excellent questions to which I don't have good enough answers. But obviously, the Enlightenment state is grafted on the states that were before it. And obviously, the Enlightenment state did not invent violence and mass murder. It simply improved. Actually, when I was thinking about whether Marx would recognize that disciple in Stalin, he'd probably call Stalin's system another example of Asiatic despotism, which is what he considered Tsarist Russia to be, okay, with all the prejudice of a white colonial Europe. But the Enlightenment state not only increased the power, it invented a new way of implementing it. And here, really, one has to pay tribute to the power of imagination. Until the Nazis, until the Soviets, nobody really had thought in the terms of this extraordinary title of an American book on comparative genocide by social anthropologist Shiro and Macaulay, which is, why not just kill them all? We sometimes ask ourselves the question, oh, how is it possible that humans could do such horrible things? And my question is, how is it that it doesn't happen more often? Given the fact of just how easy it is once you start it. And I'm sorry, your second question was even better and I forgot it.
The one about...
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, don't overestimate Nuremberg. Nuremberg was still very attentive to the law it had inherited. So, for instance, nobody was prosecuted in Nuremberg for crimes committed by the Third Reich against German Jews. Because the principle that the state is sovereign in how it treats its citizens could not be challenged, right? So, yes, it was horrible to kill Jews in Poland or in the Netherlands, but in Germany, okay. I mean, it was German Jews, property of the German state, end of story. And my understanding of the dissenting voice of the Indian judge at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal would be, so how about Bengal, right? And if we don't factor this in, what kind of justice are we speaking of? But this is really the problem because, and this is another huge can of worms, but this really addresses the moral underpinning of the concept of war crimes, because the concept of war crimes is really there to make us believe that the rest of war is somehow okay, right? Okay, there are war crimes that are horrible stuff, and we punish that, and we refute them. But then the rest is, well, by and large, it's okay. And of course, it's not. But since a war crimes tribunal is by definition the tribunal of the victors, because the defeated do not have the sovereignty to have a tribunal, the victors will not try themselves by the same standards as they tried those who were defeated. So this is why Bengal couldn't be factored in, and this is why it is legitimate to consider both Nuremberg and Tokyo as much more exercises in practical politics than in justice. But having said that, what else is there on the menu, right? I mean, the alternative would be not to have those trials, not to have better trials. That was not possible. So a bad trial in this case, I believe, is better than no trial at all. Just let's get carried away with ourselves.
So that I see you all. I mean, I think I see you all. I'm going through the sides of the room. I see David, Philip, Elida, Jonathan, and Finton, and so that we do, in that order, so that we don't wind up being more than half an hour over schedule, and we can still get some lunch. David.
Kostak, I want to go back to the Polish woman who saved the Jewish neighbors whom she didn't like very much. Because that's the kind of question that I find myself asking myself at times in the situations that I'm living in. That is, what is it that motivates some people to resist? Especially when resistance entails real risk involved. And I have to say that the numbers are usually pretty few. You said that this is our hope. I was going to ask you, how many resistors does it take for us to save, a huge number of people from disaster? 5 people, 10 people, like in Sdom. I don't know how many people
Arendt said 1 in Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Yeah,
it was enough to save the world. I mean,
well, that's a tremendously interesting theological point, but I don't think it's a practical point. 1 may not be enough. But when I look around me at the young Israelis who are now taking these risks, one thing I can say is that there's no common denominator. There's no way you can predict who's going to do it. And also there's no uniformity of motivations insofar as one could even begin to perhaps guess at the motivations, because they're very diverse. But the motivations don't actually matter very much. What matters is there are people who do actually the right things. Often it's very surprising, because these are people who might be the least likely resistors that you would expect, and yet nonetheless, there they are. But there is one thing I think I can say about these young Israeli activists now, who are actually living in the Palestinian territory, sleeping overnights in the villages, and there's day by day taking incredible risks, and they're being beaten up and arrested and all of those things. The one thing that is most striking about them is their nonchalance. There's no element of self-righteousness or anything even remotely like that. They think they are doing just the simple, most natural human thing in the world, and they don't make a big deal of it. I'm impressed by that.
There's an entire group of people in Poland now working to help Poland's illegal refugees. Poland has its PC refugees, almost 2 million Ukrainians that Poles took into their houses. And that's extraordinary, that's wonderful. But on the Belarus border, Poland is killing people for the crime of trying to save their lives, right? We found 54 bodies, and these are the bodies we found. And my elder daughter is working there, so I don't get to see her much. She spends her time in the forest. And I've gotten to know those young people. Well, they're not risking their lives, but they've been already prosecuted twice unsuccessfully, but third time lucky, for human trafficking, you see. Seriously, that was the accusation. And yes, they are entirely nonchalant. Don't even try telling them that they're wonderful or noble. You'll be wasting their time. The one thing that I get very strongly from them, and I would assume that this is also something you'd be getting from those activists you describe, it wouldn't be worth living with myself if not, right? Okay, everybody does what they can to avoid it. It's not that they rush into it because, okay, there is an opportunity to stand up for the... No. As long as it's possible to avoid it, you avoid it. And then it hits you in the face in an unexpected moment, and you can't anymore. And you can't live with yourself if you turn away consciously. This is my experience with those people. And I think from what I know of the righteous Gentiles, it was very much the same thing. It's not that they would stand up against aggression and discrimination and whatever. No, they do their best to avoid as long as it's avoidable. And then once it's not about the victim. It's about me. It's about whom I see in the mirror when I brush my teeth, okay? And therefore, the entire system of motivation you refer to is secondary. It's like a rationalization, right? You do the right thing and say, oh shit, I did the right thing. So there probably must be like an intelligent reason for that. And when I have the time, I'll think about it. And back to numbers, a couple of years ago, we hosted in Warsaw a very good delegation of Yeshiva University, very bright Jewish scholars, came to Poland to try to understand Poland. Poland is not exactly best understood in Jewish milieus, and they were really doing their best to try to understand. And they had a meeting with a friend of mine who, for years, has been, non-Jewish friend of mine, years has been doing public actions to commemorate Jewish victims in out-of-the-way towns. So Warsaw, it's simple, but a little shtetl, right? I mean, nobody remembers the name. So that he's out there and finds people to work with and whatever. And one of the visitors, after hearing him out, said, well, this is wonderful what you do, and we're all very impressed. But aren't you just a few individuals? And Zbyszek looked at me kind of puzzled and said, well, I thought this was what it was all about.
Lovely, lovely. Philip, and then the gentleman whose name I don't know in front. I haven't forgotten you. I'm sorry. I forgot the person in front of you. Elida, everybody will.
So first a quick comment to follow up what David Bell said, and then a quick question to follow up what Susan said. So it seems to me that you overstated the case about what happened in terms of public goods from during the Enlightenment. Long before the Enlightenment, monarchs were founding schools. I went to one that was founded by a monarch. They were founding hospitals. The trouble is they weren't doing it reliably. And the Enlightenment introduced the idea of education on a much broader scale, and that required the reliable, a more reliable mechanism for providing these public goods. So that's just a small correction to what you said. But I think there's something, deeply wrong with your thesis about the route from the Enlightenment to the present sort of Stalinist sort of kinds of position. It depends on this ethical premise you have of doing things for the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Now, there is an ethical theory that comes out of the late Enlightenment. It's in Jeremy Bentham. It's a very crude version of consequentialism that will supply you with that. That's for sure. But there are other, much more refined ethical theories that come out of the Enlightenment. For example, Kant's, but also other versions of consequentialism and other versions of a different kind of ethic entirely that do not warrant that conclusion. And in particular, Kant's second version of the categorical imperative, do not use human beings as means, is directly opposed to the kind of thing that you're talking about. So I think you've taken a very particular strand, one that's not always associated with the Enlightenment, by the way, although I would count Bentham as part of the Enlightenment, and you take it in its crudest version. No wonder you get trouble. That's not getting the Enlightenment responsible for it, as far as I can see.
Yeah, on the first point...
How about this? Elida is dying to say something to this point.
Well, I'm happy to follow up with what you are saying, and therefore I would like to add it here. I have a growing suspicion over the last days that we are in a trap if we identify Enlightenment with modernity. And it became very obvious to me when you said genocide is a modern phenomenon. You wouldn't have said genocide is an Enlightenment product, right? Or an enlightened phenomena. And, well, you say this, but now we have to deal with this, exactly this gesture. Why have we conflated the two terms all of the time? I think it has to do with the concept of reason. Because reason is working within modernism and it is working within Enlightenment in a different way. In modernism, it is working in the way, and Bentham is perhaps the first to show this direction, of technical rationality. So everything that we subsume under technical progress, especially progress itself. Progress is a very modernist phenomenon, and therefore we have to still distinguish this tendency of modernism and clearly distinguish it from Enlightenment. And we have to reformulate what Enlightenment is. In my paper, I was starting with the metaphors, like the garden and the illness, and there is also the light metaphor. So that is, in a way, complicated because modernity can absorb it. It's a very ancient, it's also Manichaean, dark and light. So it's much more too general to define Enlightenment, and therefore I would argue that it's really the basic moral code that you have just invoked in your examples, which has to be the core of that Enlightenment. And if we forego this moral core and adopt modernism and all the mechanisms that we have seen, we are in trouble. So please separate these terms more clearly.
I'm not sure if we can separate them without making the same mistake we would be doing if we would ascribe causality. That is, if we say Rousseau produced Marx, Marx produced Stalin, therefore Rousseau produced the Gulag, we're saying nonsense. If we say that, well, there is this ocean of ideas and they can coincide, they can go diversely, but we cannot really prove filiation, we're refusing to make use of our critical faculties. So I would be very interested in understanding better what is it that makes modernity so different from the Enlightenment that we should not ascribe the attributes of modernity to the Enlightenment. And yeah, because this would enrich my understanding of the thing. I see modernity as a child of the Enlightenment, and I see genocide and totalitarianism as bastard children of the Enlightenment, okay? Children of the Enlightenment didn't want, refuses to recognize, but are produced by the same method that children are produced always. The rest is question of social context. And I do stand corrected on the issue of schools and hospitals. Actually, kings were secondary. It was charitable orders that took care of that. Essentially, both the charitable orders and the monarchs, if they engaged in this kind of activity, it was in their own well-understood self-interest, right? The Enlightenment state said we're doing it for society, for the greater common good.
It's not the same as the greatest happiness of the greatest number.
I know, and I'm coming to this point. And yes, you are right that this was a marginal trend within the ethical reflection of the Enlightenment. Well, it is the one trend that does lead to the Gulag. There is no political formation that I think can legitimately claim to be the political incarnation of Kant's vision. So if we take as the starting point the political reality of the 20th century, and then we look for antecedents, I'm not looking for blame or even causality in the strict sense of the term. I'm looking at where do things come from. And, okay, it is not the thought of Rousseau that Stalin could claim that we are enlightened humanists. But there is a reason why Stalin didn't claim, no, we're German romantics.
This is starting to sound like Adorno and Horkheimer, but we have 3 questions. So can I ask you all, as much as we're dying to hear more from you, Kostek, can I ask you all to be slightly brief? Gentleman whose name I don't know.
Yeah, Günther Kocher. I'm just trying to put it very shortly. And I'm not a historian of philosophical sort. I'm just wondering, while you were talking about this, while you were giving your talk, and thank you very much for it as well, and that it sets off a whole flow of associations and so on. And among them, letters that I inherited from my aunt from the 1940s. And there is one when the war is already going pretty badly, and a friend of hers says, you know, we must not lose belief in the war and in the war ending victoriously for us, because it is necessary that we win the war to avert evil in the world, meaning, you know, implying that if the Jews take over, you know, that will be the end of the world. But what I wanted to ask is, what is it exactly that was lost on the way from pre-modern belief and moral systems to the Enlightenment? If you just take one example, Dante's hell, the circles of hell, and right down at the bottom of hell are the traitors, and the worst traitor is Judas, who gave away Jesus to the Romans. How is it that this you know, that this sort of morality, you know, you do not do evil to other people? Why is it lost on the way to the Enlightenment?
Well, touché, because what you're really addressing is the question, assuming I'm right, wasn't it still worth it? In the global balance of things, right? What we have lost, okay, part of it we might deplore it as a loss, part of it is, thank God it's no longer here. But even if we assume the validity of the thesis that somehow genocide and totalitarianism are the bastard children of the Enlightenment, wasn't it still worth it? And I really do not know. Okay, first of all, we are in no position to tell. We don't have an alternative history to compare, right? But it might well be that, yes, on the balance, it was worth it. This does not cancel the moral scandal. It simply prevents us from transforming what is a legitimate critique to a positive program that would said, well, without the Enlightenment, it would have been better. No, it wouldn't. No, it wouldn't. We know what the Enlightenment was up against, and we know what it produced. But I wish I could answer your question. I just don't know.
Jonathan Keir in the back.
Thanks very much. I wonder whether perhaps the answer to the what's the problem with modernity if not enlightenment question, I think Leah answered it yesterday when she said the problem is not enlightenment, the problem is capitalism. The problem with that is that 90, 100 years ago, using the Enlightenment as a kind of justification in very interesting ways, obviously the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, gave an answer to that, saying that the problem wasn't the Enlightenment, the problem was capitalism. It's very interesting.
And that worked wonderfully.
And if you read some of the, especially some of the novels from the period, someone like Olga Forsch, for example, who wrote this novel about Alexander Radishchev and rescued him as a kind of Russian proto-Enlightenment hero that was considered acceptable in that 30s context, a terrifying novel, using the Enlightenment or a parody of the Enlightenment as a kind of justification. But the question I wanted to ask you was actually totally different, was about how you would plug the Nakba into your schema. Was it done reluctantly, as Jews that had learnt in the concentration camps to be German, as you put it, or was it just a kind of standard, just an ordinary massacre like hundreds before it in history?
Well, I don't want to speculate about the motivations of the perpetrators. They would be wall to wall. Some did it reluctantly, some did it enthusiastically, some did it because of the Jewish experience in the war. If we don't fight, we're all dead. Some did it thinking of the Jewish experience of the war and thinking, shit, what are we becoming if we're doing this, even if this is necessary? So you had the literally wall-to-wall in terms of motivations, and I don't think there is any way of ascertaining which the motivation would be dominant. But in the broader scheme of things, when we're not so we Jews centered on ourselves and Europe centered on the Jews, the Nakba is banal. The Nakba is what humanity has been doing to itself throughout most of recorded history. It is in no way different from the Turco-Greek War after World War I. It's not dissimilar to the Tigray War that hopefully just ended. Part of the problem is that because of the incredible outside concentration of attention on the issue, both sides seem to believe that they're extraordinary and special, and therefore there must be some kind of extraordinary and special solution. And in history, usually this did not happen. I mean, you had clean solutions when one side was able to eliminate the others, Armenians in Anatolia. Most of the time, the problem just grew old and people stopped paying attention because something else was happening. And there was an unfair solution, unfair to one side, to the other, or to both, that you simply had to live with. But this possibility is much less probable if you've got this extraordinary external attention, which seems to postulate an extraordinary solution, which simply isn't there.
Finn O'Toole. No, it's not. No, please say. We need somebody to.
There was just simply, I suppose, two things that very briefly I thought worth saying. I mean, one is I just don't believe for a moment that the Enlightenment is where the justification of mass extermination of peoples by an idea of the common good of humanity starts. It really doesn't. You know, that idea that you get the common good and then you say that allows us then to exterminate people. If you look at the Tudor English state, for example, has a fully developed ideology of saying, and including, by the way, the garden metaphor. So Stalin's garden metaphor is fully developed, you know, in the writings of Edmund Spenser, the great Tudor poet, who's also a colonial administrator, who is saying, you know, this is so the whole colonial project is the taming of the wilderness by superior kinds of people who tame the wilderness because they are civilized, and you know, the whole civilization barbarian distinction is fully articulated, fully worked out, is given a whole historical and religious and cultural expression. So it really is. It's to do with the developments, surely, of the colonial and imperial early modern state. That's when you get this idea being given very, very full expression. And insofar as the Enlightenment comes into it, it comes into it as a reaction against that. I mean, it really does, doesn't it? I mean, it really comes in as saying, this fundamental critique of the whole colonial project. And if you leave colonialism out of it, I think you just can't really begin to deal with the whole genealogy of this set of ideas. And not just a set of ideas, but a set of practices. So the testing grounds for all of these genocides are within the colonial enterprise. And that's really where it happens, isn't it? And secondly, insofar as there is such a thing as the Enlightenment state, and it's a very difficult concept, I would have thought, but insofar as there is a single political state expression of the Enlightenment, surely it's divided government. Surely it's not saying we trust the state. We've created this benign state that does all these great things for us. Surely the whole point that comes out of the Enlightenment is that you must have not just active citizens, absolutely, as you talk, and moral citizens who are engaged, but you must actually build into the whole structure of the state all of these breaks, all of these balances, all of these checks, which are saying if you leave the state to just run on itself, it will get malign. The absolute direction of every state, the Republican tradition, which feeds into the Enlightenment and comes out of it again, I mean, is always saying that the default conduct of any set of power institutions is malign, unless you build in structures which prevent any single individual or group from having that kind of dominance which allows those kinds of things to happen. Which is why, the American Revolution, which is now being undone before our eyes, I mean, is absolutely about saying that you simply can't trust states if you don't divide power up within them. Mm-hmm. So insofar as there is an Enlightenment project, I would have thought it's anti-colonial and it's towards divided governments and towards some form of republican notion of how a state works, and so that's why I would question the usefulness of blaming the. I know you're not simply blaming the Enlightenment, but even saying that this is an outcome of a certain kind of potential of Enlightenment. I think it's an outcome of potentials which are there long before the Enlightenment, and that the Enlightenment imperfectly and in all sorts of qualified ways seeks to check.
I fundamentally disagree with you on the first point, because the difference between the colonial project and the genocide project is that the colonial project was premised on the idea we need to subdue them and civilize them to exploit them.
And often to exterminate them.
You had acts of genocide, like in the conquest of the West in the US. You didn't have one colonial project that was premised on the idea of exterminating all the brutes, end quote. No. The first time this occurs is German Southwest Africa, Namibia, and General von Trotha.
The tutors say this explicitly in Ireland. The only thing we can really do now is exterminate the indigenous population for the good of humanity, for the good of civilization. That's what we have to do. They don't have the means to do it. But what they conceive of, the only mechanism they can think of doing it is famine. But it doesn't quite work. But the full ideological project is there.
I would not agree with that for the very simple reason that there is a difference between the utilitarian concept of conquest, which you can, yes, then really go back to the Romans and indeed to the Mongols. Yeah. Genocide is something new because it brings in a redemptive value. The colonial project
Cromwell
is...
did too, didn't he? I mean,
Pardon?
Cromwell was pretty redemptive.
Very redemptive. But we save our souls.
I didn't hear you. Who was?
Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell.
Oh.
He was saying very explicitly, we save our souls. This is
Yes.
a literal salvation.
This again is different, because that harks back to the Crusades, especially the European Crusades. Kill them all and God will recognize his own, right? The idea that the nation, or possibly humanity, will be better off if those people cease to exist is not the same idea as killing miscreants will be a good thing for our souls, or we can do better with this land that those savages live on, so let's get rid of them and take it over. The previous ideas are self-interested in the material, spiritual way. Genocide really is messianic. It is about bringing in a better age. I do agree with you on the second point, and maybe I should have made it more explicitly. There are enlightenments, right? They're very different traditions, but this, in fact, is true of any major school of thought. You can attribute the Crusades to Christianity or Jesus personally. You can attribute dissidents who protected the rights of minorities to the very same tradition, right? So obviously, much of the resistance to the Enlightenment project comes from the Enlightenment project itself. And this is part of its success. It is so polyformic, it's a Protean thing, that you can't really, it's like nailing down an amoeba, right? So I certainly should have said more explicitly that there are different trends in the tradition, and I'm not looking for blame. But I do see a continuity of what starts as a kind of vague nuvula of possibilities, and then it really concretizes to the very practical, concrete reality of a gas chamber. It doesn't mean that all the nuvula was about was a gas chamber. That's ridiculous.